please unmute your microphones and raise your right hands.
Hello and welcome to a TechCrunch virtual roundtable going over the congressional hearings between big tech and antitrust oversight. My name is Alex Wilhelm. I'm a reporter here at TechCrunch. And I'm joined today by two of my absolute favorite people, including Devin Coldway, a reporter at TC over in Seattle. Devin, how are you?
Not too bad, thank you.
And we also have Taylor Hatmaker, a reporter for TC over in Portland, Oregon. Taylor, hello.
Hello.
Now, yesterday was 75 hours long by my estimation of sitting here watching C-SPAN and kind of struggling through it. But Taylor, can you start us off with a summary of why yesterday was so important and how long it took us to kind of get to that moment?
Yesterday's hearing was a little bit different than a lot of the hearings that we've seen. Like now we're kind of used to, oh, there's a big tech hearing today. Like everybody tune in, after the disinformation stuff and the Russia hearing and a few hearings we've had. Yesterday was a little different. It was the sixth part of an investigation by the House Judiciary's Antitrust Subcommittee. And actually, the real name is longer, and I did not say the whole name of that subcommittee. It's a very long name. But it was the sixth chapter in this investigation, and the sixth chapter was another hearing. There have been 5 other hearings to date, but they haven't been like, star-studded casts of folks like yesterday. We had 4 of the CEOs of the most important companies in the world. So obviously, just having those CEOs there to begin with made that hearing a huge deal. But also the fact that the hearing was the conclusion or moving toward the conclusion of an ongoing investigation in Congress gave it a pretty different feel as well.
All right. Now, before we get into what was said and kind of the blow by blow of different tech companies and the responses to criticisms and other questions, there was a kind of a sideshow element to the entire day in which certain members of Congress took things less seriously, I think is how I'd put it. And they push personal agendas and other things more to the fore than the antitrust stuff. So, Devin, for people who didn't watch this, what was going on around the periphery of the conversation and from people like Representative Gates?
There was a lot of sideshows, like you said. We started out with Jim Jordan having a temper tantrum about not being able to bring in someone at the last minute, and that was like already setting the tone for like what kind of garbage we were going to have in there. People were just bringing in a lot of the current political atmosphere that has very little to do with the actual the substance of the meetings and the investigation. So there was a lot of stuff. There was a huge amount of questions about the conservative bias, the perceived conservative bias bias against conservatives in big tech, but very little of that was substantiated, whereas a lot of the antitrust stuff that was being asked about was substantiated. So there was actually a pretty clear cut between what you could see as the political side and what was the actual sort of investigatory side. But it was not convincing.
I think by the 3rd or 4th hour of this, I was beginning to see the lines between the two blur, but I'm glad that you were there to kind of keep tabs and keep them separate. Let's talk about the individual companies. We had 4 major American tech firms. All of the big 5, except for Microsoft, were on hand. And to me, watching it, I was most surprised by how many questions Facebook got. I thought Amazon was going to take kind of more stick. So I'm curious, Taylor, when you were thinking about the Facebook moments that really stood out, what was the most important thing that Zuck got himself into during the conversations?
Honestly, there were a lot of moments. Facebook did take a lot of heat, which I expected. I mean, the reason for that is that I think Facebook as a platform is open to the criticisms like the Devin was just talking about, these kind of like unfounded criticisms of anti-conservative bias where people are doing the more like, performing politicality thing than they are like actually talking about antitrust issues, which granted are pretty boring. Like nobody wants to talk about the details of antitrust issues. Like it's boring, even for us who are, we're quite interested in this, and it's still pretty dry and detailed. So I think, Zuckerberg took a lot of heat on some of the kind of nonsense stuff, but also rightfully on a lot of other stuff. I mean, Facebook is a very big company. And they got a lot into Facebook's acquisitions, particularly the 2012 acquisition of Instagram, which I think in a lot of ways I've always looked at as kind of kicking off a new chapter of big tech companies. Like, I think that's the moment we can look back to and say, wow, that's like, we really, set a course for where we are now from that moment in some ways. And so it was interesting to see that.
So for people who have kind of forgotten back to 2012, which is, 114 years ago now, what about that moment really set the tone for modern tech? Was it the bringing on of another platform to Facebook's own platform? Was it something else? How do you think about that historically?
Well, it was the first really big, kind of flashy tech deal of a product that people use every day. And I mean, a funny thing happened during the hearing where Zuckerberg simultaneously downplayed the significance of Instagram at the time, while the committee in the background was releasing documents, including Zuckerberg's conversations with Kevin Systrom, the creator of Instagram, talking about what a huge threat Instagram was to Facebook as a platform. So Zuckerberg's like, no, it wasn't that big a deal. Like, people weren't using it as a social network back then. So I found all of that exchange really interesting. Instagram, the acquisition of Instagram kicked off a whole decade, essentially, of just tech growth that was unfettered.
Yeah. Actually, I think in going back to our reporting from the time, our own Sarah Perez called Instagram a social network actually back in 2012. So even us, we mere observers were calling it that back in the day. Devin, over to you on the comments from Representative Nadler. He said that, if this was an illegal merger at the time, why shouldn't we break off Instagram to a separate company now? Is that a concern that Facebook actually has that might happen? Or is that more of a threat to set the tone for how Congress will approach these major tech companies and platforms in the future?
I think it's more of a threat in the future. I think it's extremely unlikely that the FTC is going to revisit those things 10 years later, and much more likely that Congress is going to attempt to pass laws or modify current laws so that something like that doesn't happen going forward. Because unraveling that would be a huge legal and it would be so complicated for so many reasons, and it wouldn't actually, at this point, I think, serve too much of a purpose. Whereas getting a law in place that prevents that kind of thing from happening in the near future would be much more effective.
I want to bring up another Facebook issue before we talk about any other company, which was the conversation that was had between Zuckerberg and Congress about Onavo and then later Facebook research. And one thing I noticed during this kind of back and forth, but I think Representative Jackson maybe, was Zuckerberg's inability to be specific and to remember what happened. And I was curious if that's the sort of thing we should expect from these companies as time goes along, or if that was a particularly evasive set of notes from Facebook's CEO.
That was particularly evasive, and it was Representative it was Hank Johnson from Georgia, and he was doing a very good, very straightforward questioning about this Onavo thing, where he was basically saying, like, look, you did something that was pretty much illegal and also against another platform's rules. You got caught, then you just secretly did it again and got caught again. So why should we trust anything you say? And as if to sort of punctuate that thought, Zuckerberg basically pretended not to know what he was talking about. He said, Congressman, I'm not familiar with that. And it's like, this was one of the most major issues for Facebook of 2019. Huge issue, took down their internal apps for days, led to national headlines. Senator sent a letter to Zuck, and he's saying, oh, I'm not sure I recall that. He later sort of modified that statement to say, oh, I just didn't recall that particular name. Even that, I don't believe for a second, because Zuckerberg has a brain, a big one, that is going to remember every single detail of these things. So that was super evasive and super disingenuous. And I'm kind of surprised at just how disingenuous and evasive it was.
I'm going to go to Taylor and Amazon in a second, but before we let Facebook off the hook, there was a particular moment that to me summarized my view of Congress and how they approach tech companies. Representative Sensenbrenner asked Mark Zuckerberg about a Twitter issue. I was curious, Devin, when you saw this, what were your thoughts? Well, first of all, tell us what happened. And then I want to know if you think that's kind of how good Congress is at this stuff, or if they've actually gotten better over the last couple of years at technology issues.
Some of them have gotten better, but yeah, Sensenbrenner was complaining about, I believe it was Don Trump Jr. who posted something of that frontline doctors garbage that got posted the other day, and he was complaining to Mark Zuckerberg that Don Jr. got taken off or got his account suspended, and everybody watching is thinking didn't that happen on Twitter?
Wasn't that on Twitter?
Yeah, and of course, and Zuckerberg, to his credit, immediately and very calmly said, well, I believe that was on Twitter, actually, but I'm happy to answer the question, which I thought he took it in a very sort of graceful way, honestly, because it's such a dumb thing. But it was like a total mischaracterization of the situation, and it was very wrong. And it's definitely characteristic of Congress recently to basically have no idea what they're talking about, and only a very few Congress people and senators have any idea what they're talking about, and even then, they're nowhere near the expert level that you really need to be having talks with someone like Sundar Pichai.
Sure.
These are people who are at top of the game of some of the most important companies in the world. And this guy, what was it? Stube was basically getting Google support from Sundar. It's like, this is ridiculous. So yeah, I think that they are getting better in that they are getting slammed for not producing effective legislation because they are so ignorant. So they are reaching out more to their aides and to honestly to the tech industry and lobbyists for help. But obviously they didn't do it as they didn't all do it enough this time.
I have something to add to this, if that's
please.
cool. I agree with the Sensenbrenner moment was very ridiculous for a lot of reasons, but on the whole, I did feel like, and maybe this isn't a popular opinion, but I do think Congress is getting better. I mean, they're sure there are plenty of people with their, bizarre axes to grind, off topic, whatever in Congress. But I thought this hearing in general was even kind of hard to follow as a reporter who's really familiar with all of these little data points, arguing that these companies are monopolies, because it moves so quickly from like stories that have been reported by journalists like us over the last, 3 to 5 years or whatever. I mean, and some stuff more recently, but these hearings really went from topic to topic. They were like, this was reported, this happened, this was exposed, this. And a lot of them really touched on investigative reporting moments. Like, you could like list this huge list of stories from every outlet. It was basically like where all of this information was coming from. And they also did have documents that weren't released until yesterday, which I thought was actually one of the most remarkable parts about the hearing. Yeah. And I, talked about before, but they were releasing these internal documents as the hearing was going. So I think those things did make it much more substantive. And I think they're realizing, members of Congress are realizing that even if they don't have the expertise to understand the social networks, like people like us are out here doing the journalism, explaining things, exposing things, and relying on that is really useful.
One story that came up was the Wall Street Journal story on Amazon and how that company uses data that it says it doesn't use to figure out where it might want to build its own products and that sort of thing. This was also, Taylor, Jeff Bezos' first appearance before Congress, I believe. So one, how did Jeff do you think? And then how do you think he did kind of squirming around the data use issue that was brought up from the Wall Street Journal story?
I think Jeff Bezos did pretty well. I mean, as far as defending Amazon's many controversies. I mean, I think Congress kind of didn't know what to do with Jeff Bezos. They've never faced him before. And I think in the same way, actually, they didn't know as much what to do with Tim Cook and Apple. The New York Times had like a useful little tool where they ranked like who got the most questions. And I think Sundar was first, Sundar Pichai at Google. And then it was Mark Zuckerberg. And then it was Amazon and Tim Cook. And I think with Amazon and with Apple, those are just really different companies compared to the kind of like social platforms that we're used to looking at. And we're used to yelling about things like, oh, political bias or disinformation. Like that stuff doesn't apply to Amazon or Apple in the same way. And so I think in a lot of ways, Congress kind of didn't know what to do with their time quite as well. I think, if they can drag Jeff Bezos back to Congress, maybe in the future when he can appear in person, which seems kind of unlikely he'd even be willing to do that. I think that they can build on the foundation that they set here. But I think, you kind of have to figure people out. And I don't think they quite knew how to come at Jeff Bezos. That said, I still do think he looked like a supervillain. So,
yeah, I want to talk about just that before we talk about the other two companies and the talks that happened. This was a virtual event. People were on Cisco's WebEx platform. There was some lag. Jeff Bezos had to unmute himself at some point in time. Congress was a mix of in person and not. How do you guys think that impacted the hearings themselves? And do you think that the tech executives got a little bit lucky because they didn't actually have to be there in person, sweating it out under the lights? They got to be effectively at home.
I think the fact that the hearing was remote to begin with is why those 4 individuals even agreed to do it. I mean, part of the hearing that these people really dread is the moment where, Getty Images and Reuters and everyone else is there snapping photos and they like raise their right hand and they take that oath. They do not want those photos. I mean, I've even heard like anecdotal reports of like, oh, we're, PR, we're trying to avoid that moment. Facebook doesn't want that moment. Google doesn't want that moment. You don't get that. Nobody's going to use like a screen cap of people, being sworn in this like very damning visual moment, that's kind of like a reference point for the whole hearing as a whole. Nobody, those swearing in moments are something they really love to avoid. And with the digital format, they didn't have those. And I think that is part of the reason that they agreed to do the hearings to begin with. I don't think Jeff Bezos would agree to appear in Congress IRL. I think there's a reason he hasn't agreed before. And I think there's a reason he did it remotely. So I don't know if we're even going to be able to recreate these same appearances in the future.
Well, we'll see about that.
Matt, I would add only. I think that they definitely got a huge advantage in doing it this way. Partly because they're not there by themselves the way they always like. When you had like Mark Zuckerberg, sure, he had a big stack of paper and some other stuff, but it was really just him and his counsel was out in the background somewhere. They couldn't whisper in his ear. and they couldn't whisper in anybody's ear on the Zoom call or whatever, the Cisco call. But they probably had monitors set up. They had like a whole room full of people who were checking things they were saying. So they had the advantage of being able to use prepared statements and say like, "Oh, I don't have those documents in front of me," while there's an intern holding up a big screen saying like, "Hey, you just perjured yourself, Mark Zuckerberg. Like you need to go back on that." Obviously, he didn't, but like somebody yelling like, "Dude, do something about this." So I think that they got a pretty easy version of these events.
Wasn't there a moment where Jeff Bezos, his internet cut out? Like, so it's like he can go check his notes.
Yeah.
He's like doing a bathroom break, eating a cheese stick. It's
sorry, Senator, you're breaking up.
There are a lot of advantages to the remote
anti what? Sorry.
Yeah, I always wanted to spend my entire day watching boomers do Zoom. It's really just my absolute favorite thing to do to pass the time. I want to go to Alphabet, and by that I really mean Google. And Devin, I was going through some of your coverage and notes, and there were three things that really stood out. There was the Cicilline kind of back and forth with my representative in Congress, actually. There was the Representative Buck issue about fascism and putting people on the moon versus China. And then, of course, Rep. Gates was also talking about, working for the wrong side of things. So I'm curious, if you were going to summarize the Google portion of the hearings, what stuck out to you as substantial and possibly important?
I thought it was kind of weird that they really kind of glommed onto these like phantom issues of like, you're working for the Chinese military, and they're like, we have a research consultant at like this great university in China, and they're like, so you're working with the Chinese Academy of Sciences to advance Chinese bomber drones, and they're like, no. And why aren't you working with our military? And they're like, we are. And they didn't pay attention to any of those answers, when like really the question with Google is it's ad monopoly. It's messing with search results, but not the way that they were saying. Like, what was some guy saying that he Googled an outlet's name and it didn't show up? And then he was like, but then mysteriously it started showing up again. It's like, that happens all the time for no good reason. Gateway Pundit, that's what it was. Stube, I think, made a big deal about this, when it's like, you could have maybe blocked that. Whose laptop were you using? There's a million reasons why this might have happened, and you're making it into a conspiracy theory when there are well-documented, non-conspiracy, serious antitrust potential issues with Google as being basically the only ad provider for 99% of searches. And it was touched on, but a lot of people took a lot of time to pursue the wrong dog in that hunt.
Yeah. Taylor, same question over to you. What else stood out from the Google portions of the multi-hour hearing?
Google is such a big company, and it does so many different things that I think, again, Google is a tough one to approach. I mean, I think, like Devin said, concentrating on the search business would have been a wise use of time. But Google is another one, I think, especially because it owns YouTube, where people in Congress, particularly Republicans in this instance and close allies of the president, can say, oh, you're burying the search results that I want. Oh, this is a political attack and whatever else. And I think Google is like an easy target for that stuff. I don't think we're getting those kind of questions from companies of Google because people don't understand the company or their services. I think we're getting those kinds of questions because those are the moments where people in Congress are, performing their allegiance to the president or their allegiance to certain values in an election year. I think Google was like a kind of a place to waste time in that way.
So then, just reading between the lines there, it doesn't sound like that many substantial blows were actually landed on Google, and that instead it got hit with a lot of political faff that won't have a lasting impact on its business and how it operates. Is that fair? I
would say so. I think that Amazon actually got when it was interacting with Representative Jayapal, she seemed to be setting the stage for a serious regulation that prevented them from being both a seller and a platform, which is a very serious consideration. But I didn't see, at least in what I paid attention to at the hearing, I didn't see anything like that for Google or really for Facebook.
So let's bring in the last company. Tim Cook was there for Apple, of course. And going back through what we covered on TechCrunch, there was a lot of notes about App Store fees, what they can charge, what apps kind of make it into the App Store, if it's kind of decided by Apple and so forth. Of the four companies, I didn't think that Apple took too much damage, but I want to make sure to get your guys' take on this. So thinking about Tim Cook's performance, Devin, starting with you, how did he do? And any moments that really stuck out in your coverage?
I think he did pretty well, but Tim is an old hand at this kind of stuff. And I think that he had the easiest job of it because of all of them, he seems to be the least monopoly-like. It's like certainly Apple has an extremely strong, extremely well-protected ecosystem. But when, he can say, look, only 20% of the phones in the world are iPhones. You know, they may be dominant
Right.
here or there, but like we don't have a monopoly. And yeah, we do control every app that goes onto the App Store, but you know, there's a really good reason for that. Look, I feel like he was out of politeness, not saying like, look at Sundar's fucking App Store. Excuse me, but
No,
like that's it's
fine. We're allowed
garbage.
to
It's
swear.
horrible. Like you know, it's full of junk, and I think that Tim Cook was in a strong position to defend Apple's practices, and that there really wasn't a lot to bring in against him, except that some of those practices are mean. I don't think that they are something that the government needs to step in. I think it's something where tech as an industry needs to say there are better options, there are better methods, and Apple get on board.
One of the moments, Taylor, that caught my eye was when I think it was Representative Johnson again asked if they could raise the App Store fees to 50%, not just 30%. And Tim Cook effectively had to say, well, yeah, we could if we wanted to. Do you think that question was fair, Taylor? And if so, was it useful for the conversation about Apple's power inside the technology market?
You know, in general, I think that Apple is just a really different company than some of the other companies up there. And Apple is also like a really well-loved company by consumers, which I think puts questioners posing questions like that. Oh, you could charge, you could charge less for folks to list their software here or whatever. I think it puts people in an odd position in Congress because Apple is a company that people still regard really highly. Whereas, if you poll people, oh, how do you feel about Facebook as a company? How do you feel about Google? People are like, well, I kind of feel like they're evil and they're stealing all of my shit. But Apple, you're like, well, I like my iPhone. That's cool. Like, people think of Apple as a hardware company largely. And I think people in Congress tried to get at some of the App Store stuff, which we've seen reported more recently. And I do think that questioning was pretty fair, though I also think Tim Cook is really good and a really, somebody who comes off really well in this kind of thing. He's very likable. He's got like the kind of down home Alabama thing going on. He doesn't have this like data overlord supervillain vibe that we get from, I don't want to name names, Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and Sundar to some extent. But, I think in general, Tim Cook has a different vibe. And I think he performed well yesterday.
Yeah, one of the best moments I think was when Tim Cook pronounced it Samsung. I think that was one of my favorite moments. His slight accent comes in occasionally.
He did it like 3 times. It really caught my attention.
Oh, I only heard the first one. Gosh, apparently if you're listening to this on video, there were so many hours of hearings. You eventually had to leave to go do something else at some point in time. So we all missed a moment or two here and there. Before we break though, I want to bring up one more theme that was interesting, which is the pandemic making technology companies more powerful. And I think one thing anyone who's been watching the tech world has seen this year is after a correction in March, tech companies have come back very, very strong, even during the COVID-19 era. But it was mentioned during the hearings that possibly tech companies are more powerful now because of the pandemic and kind of the changed economy. So I was curious if you guys find that line of reasoning or argument is reasonable. And if so, what impact that might have on future regulation that we might see on these major technology companies and platforms.
That's actually something I wanted to hear a lot more of yesterday. Going into the hearing, one of the first moments was David Cicilline released his opening statements, and they were saying, the COVID-19 crisis makes all of these issues so much more acute, and that's why we're having this conversation right now. And I was like, wow, that is actually a really effective line of reasoning. And I've covered it in the past, but we've seen a few other lawmakers raise alarm bells about things like, Amy Klobuchar's like, hey, Google's trying to buy Fitbit, or they're buying Fitbit right now. We need to look at these things. We need to examine if these are the choices we want to make, because you might get, 8 years down the road and look back on it and be like, wow, that was the Instagram, Facebook moment. We really screwed that up. But in general, I think, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they proposed actually legislation that would freeze all mergers during this time. And I think I would have really loved to hear more about that kind of legislative proposal, though also because the chairman of the subcommittee that we saw yesterday, David Cicilline, also agrees with the idea of freezing mergers during the COVID-19 crisis. So tech companies can't just consolidate all of this power, which is what we're seeing. That's a proposal that he backs. So I think we could see that when this is all over and that subcommittee releases their report with recommendations. I do think we might see legislation specifically pertaining to the COVID-19 crisis.
Devin, do you agree?
I do, and I think that part of what's interesting about the COVID crisis in tech is that it hasn't been reliably picking winners and losers. There's been a lot of chaos, and no one really knows. Like Zoom was nothing before all this, and now Zoom is like one of the most used pieces of software in the world. And who knows what else that's is gonna have that effect on. So it's chaotic, and no one really knows what's going to happen. So I think that the safest route would be to like freeze mergers, to prevent opportunistic actions and other things. But yeah, I think that it's hard to say what's actually going to happen. This is a extremely chaotic time, and but I think that the safe route is the conservative route in this case.
So just to kind of take us to the end here, Taylor, looking forward, looking to the future, will we see more hearings like this with single companies, multiple companies? Is there going to be legislation coming soon for us to talk about? Or will the impacts of this hearing come in a couple of quarters from now and therefore a little bit outside of our current field of view?
I think what this hearing really did is kind of looking at it like almost like a pep rally for these issues. Like it draws a lot of attention. Sure, not a lot of conclusions get reached. And I think a lot of folks in tech are like, Congress doesn't understand technology. Nothing ever comes to these hearings, blah, blah, blah. But I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of like what the hearings are for. They're basically press conferences. You know, they're like, hey, these are some issues people should be worried about. I would say that like if you were just the average viewer, not somebody who writes for TechCrunch or whatever, and you just tuned into that hearing yesterday, you'd be like, wow, this is like a pretty airtight case that all of these companies are monopolies, you know? Like if you just had no prior knowledge, you wouldn't walk away and being like, oh no, I think the companies look pretty good. You know, so I think it opens a broad public conversation. I mean, I heard of friends who don't follow tech at all tuning into the hearing yesterday. And I'm like, that's crazy. A, we don't even want to watch it. We have to. That's insane. But I think in general, these hearings draw a lot of attention to these issues and they kind of set a foundation for where the conversation is going to go. And I think one thing that's particularly noteworthy about this hearing is both that it came from a serious subcommittee. Like the chairman of the hearing is well regarded. He's considered a viable threat to technology and its power and everything else. And this committee is producing a report, and it's going to produce a report with recommendations, legislative recommendations. And I mean, some folks on the hearing are serious politicians who have serious concerns about these issues. It wasn't all just showboating. And so I think we're going to see legislative proposals spring out of this. We might see more support for other things. And we also might see some, you know, bipartisan interest in really breaking up these tech companies or just considering mergers and everything else in a different way moving forward in a way that we haven't seen so far.
All right. Well, Devin Coldaway, Taylor Hatmaker, thank you very much for your time. We'll do this again the next time we're all dragged through the C-SPAN gauntlet. But in the meantime, this is TechCrunch, and we'll talk to you all very soon.